All right, what's going on is the ascension of Babylon. What we do here is we talk about the occult, we talk about spiritual self-development, and we talk about the healing process. And specifically, what we are going to be talking about in this video is the abyss. We're going to be talking about both the qlippothic abyss and the sephirothic abyss as well, because both the Sephiroth and the qlippoth abyss are just two aspects of the same thing. So with the Sephiroth, it's going to be the more positive masculine polarity of the abyss, much more associated with the tangible cosmos. And when we're talking about the qlippoth, this is going to be the more primordial, dark feminine components of the abyss, much more associated with these liminal spaces outside of the cosmos. And paradoxically, even though I say outside of the cosmos, it actually gives birth to the cosmos. So what I'm saying is the qlippothic abyss actually leads you to the void. It leads you to the deepest portions of the primordial womb, which is actually the deepest portions of our own unconscious, because inside of us we hold the blueprint for all of creation, and all of creation comes from this pre-manifest space, or what we can call the unmanifest void. So let's start with the Sephiroth abyss. So here is our sephirothic tree. This is known by most people to be the tree of life, and right in the middle, right here, is known as the 11th hidden sphere of Thoth. And this is a very important part of the initiatory process. Once a person goes through all of these 7 spheres, or the first 7 spheres, because there's 10, so the first 7, which is the bottom of the tree, they hit this threshold, and this threshold is known as the abyss. This is the 11th hidden sphere on the tree that separates the top of the tree, which is in connection to our upper chakras, the third eye and the crown, from the bottom of the tree, which is when we are working with the spheres that are in connection with the throat down. So it's going to be the throat chakra, the heart, the solar plexus, the sacral, and the root. So to start accessing the upper chakras, there's this plunge into the unconscious that we have to take. But there is this threshold that typically keeps the average person from being able to take that plunge in a sustainable way to where they can actually access the upper chakras that the upper part of the tree actually represents. And there's a reason for this. If the nervous system is not adequately and properly prepared for this endeavor, there could be potential dangers and potential risks. One of them is going to be the overstimulation of the physical body and the nervous system, because it hasn't gone through the process of neurobiological upgrade that it needed to actually start pulling in those higher frequency, higher dimensional kinds of energies that are associated with both the third eye and the crown chakras. So working with the bottom of the tree in the form of the 7 spheres that I referred to, and then going through the crossing of the abyss, is how we do this when we're working with the Kabbalistic system. So we are coming in contact with the limiting forces inside of us that would actually create a interfering frequency between us and the higher states of awareness that are the natural byproducts of working with and activating the upper chakras that the supernal triad of this Kabbalistic tree is going to represent. So when we open up the 11th hidden sphere of Thoth, we are being confronted by different parts of us that we rejected up until then, different identities and negative personality traits, and the different wounded, more sensitive parts of us that we formed those identities and those negative personality traits to actually avoid. And all of this becomes personified by an enemy, an entity known as shugal. Shugal is one half of the beast of 666. So shugal is associated with the number 333. Choronzon, who we're going to be talking about later, also associated with the number 333. Together, they make up the beast of 666, and they are two polarities of the same thing. Shugal is the more masculine polarity. Choronzon is the more feminine polarity. So shugal is bringing us into the more masculine aspects of our created universe and of the created universe, or the created cosmos in general, by guiding us into the parts of our unconscious that the blueprint for those created aspects is actually existing. So inside of our unconscious is the blueprint for everything we have ever created and everything that we are likely to create, as well as everything in the tangible universe or in the cosmos in general, because we are the creator, or we are God experiencing itself in a microcosmic form. So this means the entirety of creation exists inside of us as our raw, primal, evolutionary potential that we have the ability to access when the proper conditions are actually met. And this is what the crossing of the abyss is about. It is the thinning of the veil that has been keeping us from accessing that raw potential inside of us. And that raw potential is actually fleshed out and crystallized much more when we cross the abyss and we move into the sphere of Bina, then we move into Hakma, and then we move into Kether. Kether symbolizing the crown chakra. But to actually access those spheres, which represent the upper chakras, in a way that's sustainable and long-term, we actually have to process enough of the suppressed negative energies inside of us that are going to be showed to us by shugal. So this is the gatekeeper of the abyss. And it's this threshold that we're not able to actually move through or pass unless we confront shugal, who is just a personification of everything that we have been rejecting in ourselves up until that point. So shugal is not just this external force that you need to go into the abyss and you need to fight against, and you need to overcome, and you need to push against, like certain occult literature may lead you on to believe. Shugal is the accumulation of what you have suppressed, personified as what a lot of people would view as a demonic kind of intelligence. And your job is to not reject shugal, because shugal represents the rejected aspects of yourself that you need to actually own in order to cross the abyss. So you actually need to absorb shugal. You need to accept shugal. And essentially, you need to love shugal as a part of yourself, because shugal is all the different parts of yourself that you have rejected. And not only just negative personality traits, protector parts, and then the other wounded parts of you, definitely wounded inner child parts, that you use those other parts and personality traits and stuff like that to reject. But shugal is also your primal potential and primal parts of you that are associated with the reptilian brain as well. So once again, shugal is everything that you've learned to reject within yourself. And the reason why shugal can take a very demonic kind of manifestation with even various different animalistic qualities is because this is what we have rejected and demonized inside of ourselves. So if you're actually able to see shugal, this might be a being that seems like it's very scary or potentially very frightening depending on you as the practitioner, because these are the parts of yourself that you were frightened of all along. So this is what shugal is an accumulation of, and by accepting shugal and processing the energy that shugal actually represents, you are at some point going to cross the abyss. Now, the crossing of the sephirothic abyss is directly connected to embodying your higher self and actually walking a path to eventually start interacting with the more raw, unfiltered aspects of the higher self that are symbolized by Ein Sof Or, Ein, and the different veils above Kether leading you to the void. So that's going to be this section of the tree right here above Kether. So when you're crossing the abyss, you're initiating this lifelong process, or when you're crossing the Sephiroth abyss, you're initiating a lifelong transformative process to where you have dissolved enough of the veil that was separating the conscious self from the unconscious, to where there's going to be this continual primal influx of energies that you are now receiving conscious self to unconscious self. And these veils above Kether represent the more raw, unfiltered aspects of your higher self that are actually existing within your unconscious. So this is important to understand when it comes to the sephirothic abyss, because the whole tree of life experience is aligning you to your higher self, so your nervous system can become attuned to the energy of the higher self in a way to where you're now able to embody that within your physical vessel, rather than operating in a way to where you're disconnected from the higher self. And the higher self is a vast, vast body of energy. It's certainly not all love and light or anything like that. Those are faulty perceptions when people think like that. Of course, yes, the higher self is absolutely connected to love and is absolutely very supportive of the evolutionary process, because it is you and you are it. Why wouldn't it support itself? But there are these more unregulated, raw, unfiltered aspects of the higher self that, whether you know it or not, initiating into the sephirothic abyss is actually setting you up to experience these very raw, very seemingly intangible aspects of the higher self. And of course, this can come with pressure, and this can come with catalyst, because it's this very, let me say, these very void-like spaces of the higher self. You can almost look at it this way. So the same way you have an unconscious that holds your evolutionary potential, evolutionary potential that can be very raw and unfiltered, your higher self, which is like what you can think to be your higher mind, also has like these unfiltered aspects in its unconscious. So the higher self is continually evolving. So there's always growth and expansion that can take place for the higher self. It doesn't know everything or, anything like that. Let me say this, it's very knowing, but it's not all knowing. So there are unconscious layers of the higher self that it is learning to integrate, as we're learning to also integrate the different aspects of our unconscious. So the crossing of the abyss experience is thinning the veil between our conscious self and the unconscious, where all of this dormant primal potential is actually existing, but these portions of our unconscious are still in connection with the created cosmos. The more so unfiltered, less structured, unregulated aspects of them, yes, but still the created universe or the created cosmos in general. And this is where the Sephiroth abyss actually is different from the qlippothic abyss. So now let's talk about the qlippothic abyss. The qlippothic abyss is going to be ruled over typically by choronzon, but this is not black and white, and it works that way for the Sephiroth abyss as well. The way it's typically worked with is with shugal, but it doesn't have to be like that either, but that is a video for another time. I just wanted to share that with you before I continued. So conventionally, the guardian of the threshold in the qlippoth is going to be choronzon. This is the other polarity of the beast of 666. But the process that choronzon takes you into is a little bit different, because choronzon is actually setting you up to leave the created cosmos. And by leave the created cosmos, I mean awareness-wise or consciousness-wise. I don't mean your physical body's just gonna poof and you're not going to be here anymore. All of this evolutionary momentum that you go through, initiating the crossing of the abyss in the qlippoth, is going to be grounded into your physical body at some point, at least if you're doing it successfully. But the qlippoth at its core, it represents the unmanifest, and it represents aspects of reality that are so unfiltered that they actually haven't even come into a tangible form yet. It is formless, infinite, primordial potential. So when you're crossing the abyss, or you're going into the abyss of the qlippoth, you're going through this deeper evolutionary process and even a nervous system rewiring that is setting you up to access the void. And the void is that space that gives birth to the created cosmos, but is outside of it at the same time. The same way that when you come into the world as a child, you came from your mother's womb, but now you're outside of it. So this is what the initiatory process of the qlippothic abyss is all about. You are eventually getting set up to actually interact with the deepest portions of your unconscious, period. The deepest portions of your unconscious that are so deep they don't even have a definitive meaning, in the same way that the raw, unfiltered aspects of your higher self within the created cosmos do. So this space in many ways is very unknowable, and it's very intangible. So when you're going into the qlippothic abyss, you are dissolving the threshold between the conscious self and the unconscious self to such a degree that at some point these unknowable, intangible aspects that are in connection with the void in these very liminal spaces outside of the created universe are going to come to the surface, so you can now hold them and embody them within the conscious self or on a conscious self level. Now, choronzon is the same as shugal in connection to choronzon being the different parts of you that you have disowned. So these will be parts of you that project negative personality traits that you were taught are socially unacceptable, and therefore you reject them and you deny them. These will be wounded inner child parts of yourself and more sensitive parts of your being as well that you were also likely taught are unsafe for you to feel and unsafe for you to express and unsafe for you to let other people see. And of course, just like shugal as well, these are going to be parts of you that are also very animalistic and connected to the primal parts of the human being as well. The primal parts of the human being that are associated with the reptilian brain. And when you go into either of the abysses, whether it's the sephiroth or the qlippothic, there is going to be the heavy presence of death energy that is going to come into your life, because you had likely, up until that point, been creating certain relationships and friendships and connections with people and life reality experiences that were projections of your false self. They were projections of parts of you that were actually just driven by both trauma and trauma avoidance or emotional avoidance. So in other words, when we go through childhood trauma, we develop these protective adaptations within the psyche. And these adaptations are like layers that we build over the more sensitive, wounded parts of ourselves that go all the way back to these very sensitive, wounded inner child parts of us. And this is a way that we support ourselves in not feeling the emotional states of these different parts that we built these layers over in order to suppress. So we build a life experience around not feeling those energies because we're conditioned by society and, mainly conditioned by our family growing up to think that it's not safe. This could be a direct communication that maybe we're weak if we embody that or we feel that. Or I think for most people it's a more subtle communication that takes place because most parents in our society, they have rejected their own inner child. So there's this subconscious communication that's taking place that it's not safe for you to embody yours. This is something that we all experience, and this is why as human beings we now create identity masks and personas that create reality experiences for us through the medium of certain relationships, titles that we give ourselves, friendships, jobs, and things of that nature to uphold that protective layering and that protective programming and to further bypass what those wounded parts of us are actually feeling. So because we create our physical reality from this false self bypassing state, a big part of crossing the abyss can be this death energy that comes into our lives, and it starts to pressurize these different aspects of our external reality experience that are extensions of the false self. They are extensions of parts of us that have learned they need to keep us away from the more vulnerable, sensitive parts of us, as well as even the more raw, primal qualities of our being that we were taught are not acceptable to embody. We were taught this by our parents, and we were taught this by society. So this death energy comes into our lives to rewrite our internal state, and to even start rewriting and changing our external reality experience. And this is when there's conflicts in relationships. This is when people leave our lives. This is when maybe we lose our job. And this is when we actually have to trust that everything that's changing in our lives, even though it's very uncomfortable, is absolutely there to serve us. It is absolutely in alignment with our greater good. But once again, this takes the ability to trust the process. And this is why the crossing of the abyss can be a very challenging experience, because there is that element of transformation. There is that element of both outer and inner change that is taking taken place. So the difference between the Sephiroth abyss and the qlippothic abyss is how deep you are actually going into the unconscious. With the Sephiroth abyss, you are experiencing aspects of the unconscious that are still more so in connection with the tangible universe. Even when you're beginning to go into the more unregulated aspects of your higher self, later down the line when you maybe start experiencing the veils above Kether, this is still the created universe. But when you're going into the qlippothic abyss, now your consciousness is starting to leave the created universe, and you're going into the void. You're going into this formless space that actually gives birth to anything within the tangible universe, but it is absolute chaos because it is the primordial chaos. It has no definition. There are no cosmic laws or structuring principles that are governing it necessarily. It is a space that you can completely rewrite yourself without coming into contact with the ordering principles or the regulating principles of the cosmos itself. But this is what can make it quite dangerous, because you're going into the nothingness, and nothingness, I feel like, doesn't actually exist. There's no such thing as nothingness, but to our level of perception, it is so unknowable, and it creates this blank slate kind of state within our beings that requires a lot of present moment awareness and requires a lot of stillness. And these are the very things that on a nervous system level we have been wired to actually reject. We have been wired into identities to where it's do, and we need to seek validation outside of the self. We need to seek approval from our parents and from our friends and from society, and if we don't have that approval, it doesn't feel good, because we've created these responses in the system that we actually get a chemical release from when we are seeking for approval. All of that actually goes out the window in the void. And the qlippothic abyss, although it's not technically the void, is the threshold that you need to actually move through to eventually go into the void, to go into these very untangible, unmanifest spaces outside of what we understand to be reality. But once again, paradoxically, it is the womb that gives birth to everything within the created universe, to anything within the tangible, structured cosmos. But we are dealing with the essence of chaos, and this has an immense pattern interrupting effect on our nervous system, on our identities, and on our life experience in general. And it is said that going into the qlippothic abyss is kind of like entering this black hole. This is an ongoing evolutionary process, and once you are in the event horizon, you are getting sucked in, and there's nothing that you can do about it, and this is meant to eventually lead you to the void. And this is actually where a lot of people can go into some very damaging mental states. It's not actually always necessarily during the abyssal crossing. There are people that cross the abyss, but they get sucked into a much bigger evolutionary process that they weren't really aware was going to take place when they went, when they went into the crossing of the abyss experience in the qlippoth. And because they're not adequately prepared, it is more than they are actually able to handle, and this is where the delusions kind of set in. This is where a level of inner and outer collapse can take place that they just don't have the capacity to process. And this is where some of the stories kind of come from, of people losing their mind and things of that nature. It's when they start to go into that outer chaos. It's when they start to get sucked into that primordial void that, once again, the qlippothic abyss is actually setting you up to experience at some point. So, let me think if there's anything else that I wanted to talk about. I think this is it in a nutshell. You know, this is what the Sephiroth and the qlippothic abyss is actually all about. When it comes to the Sephiroth abyss, you are going into the deeper portions of the unconscious, but these are portions that, even when it's the more unregulated aspects, they are still regulated and they're still governed by the structuring, ordering principles of the cosmos. But with the qlippothic abyss, you are now eventually getting set up to connect with these very raw, completely unfiltered aspects of your unconscious that are these liminal spaces that lead you to the outer darkness. They lead you into the primordial chaos that has no definitive meaning. It has no definition other than what we choose to turn it into, and they are completely unregulated. So this is the difference between the two. If you watched the video all the way through, thank you very much. I certainly appreciate you, and I will catch you in the next video. Thank you.